Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Brent Talks podcast, produced by My Romania Community and brought to you by the Young Brent Foundation in association with Brent Council. I'm Errol Donald, and over the next 4 episodes I'll be speaking to professionals working in Brent to explore the impact of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic on communities, families and friendship groups. We'll cover a range of topics including education, youth and community and employment. And in this launch episode, we'll be discussing mental health. I'm joined by Martina Jean-Jacques, who is a practicing psychotherapist, trained in both psychodynamic counselling and cognitive behaviour therapy. Martina, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Could you give us a sense of how people in Brent are coping with the pandemic from a mental health perspective?
I would say that there's definitely more inquiries into mental health. There's more people looking to get support with their mental health in Brent. But there's also been higher cases of anxiety, within my opinion, because I don't think it's been helpful to see on the media that Brent is one of the places that, is deemed to be more at risk. So that in itself is quite a scary thought. So that has been coming a lot into the consultation rooms, as well as people having a generalised anxiety about their health and also about their lives and death as well. That's been a big thing that I've seen within the communities.
So you would say that there's a marked difference in what people are bringing post-COVID or pre-COVID to actually during the pandemic?
Yeah, most definitely, because I think with the lockdown as well, there's been a kind of forced downtime that for some people has been great, but for some it's been a forced reflection in looking at your health and having these anxieties and nobody to contain them because there's no services around. The lack of support has also changed. So there's actually places in Brent that kind of seized or changed their services. So, for example, we were seeing people face to face. That's changed. So again, there's something different about being behind the screen, offering the support, and some people do not cope well with that.
Okay, so I'm going to come on to a little bit more about how the pandemic has affected your practice, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about, your work in Brent and your understanding of the Brent community.
I absolutely loved the Brent community. It was kind of one of it was the factor that made me kind of accept the job at NHS. So I work for the IAP team, which is improving access to psychological therapies. And what we do is we provide CBT and we also provide counselling on a short-term basis. So it's about around 6 to 8 sessions we can provide to the community. And yeah, our lists are quite high at the moment. The demand is quite high. And yeah, I think...
What's CBT?
CBT is cognitive behaviour therapy. So that is a therapy that talks about our cognitions, our behaviours and our thoughts, all maintaining cycles. So in essence, our thoughts and our feelings influence our behaviours. So CBT seeks to modify or change those behaviours, so if they're not serving us well. So what we will do in the session is we will do a lot of practical work. So you'll be given tasks to do at home. You'll be given things like thought diaries, examining your thoughts, tracking those and looking at how we can change those. So it's more of a hands-on practical therapy. Counselling, I do psychodynamic counselling, but a lot of us do different forms of counselling. And counselling primarily looks at interpersonal difficulties. So if you are kind of struggling with relationships or there are issues within your life that you feel you'd like to change that are maybe reoccurring, counselling is really good to kind of provide a space without judgments that is safe for you to kind of talk those through.
Okay, thank you. So, as you mentioned earlier, Brent is one of the most affected boroughs in the country when it comes to the coronavirus. And as you know, Brent is also one of the most diverse boroughs in the capital and the country. And it's also one of the it's one of the boroughs with the highest indices for poverty,
Yeah.
Challenges around homelessness and health, and this cocktail of different challenges has kind of amplified the instances of contagion with regards to the virus, and obviously that has led to high instances of mortality. So given the context within which you're working, how has the impact actually begun to affect your practice?
I would say that my practice has kind of changed over these last kind of few months, whereas it was a bit more kind of, I don't want to say generic, but we could work with the anxiety, with the depression. Now it's an added level of like anxiety. There's an added level of uncertainty. There's now questions that are hard to answer. So for example, within my practice, I seek to help people find the answers that they need to move forward in their lives. How do you do that with COVID when we don't even have any certain answers for ourselves? So I would say that's been the biggest kind of change, the biggest, I'd say, difficulty in my practice in helping people to try and understand and get answers, because a lot of people believe that's what you can get when you come to therapy. And at some points, you know, I know myself and some other therapists, we questioned our professionalism, you know, thinking, are we doing enough during this pandemic for the people of Brent? But what I found was that sometimes it was just helpful to just be there, to actually kind of foster those connections and to listen to people so that they have a space that they can talk about how they're feeling. And it's not a news, it's not a statistic, it's just a safe space where they can kind of explore and share their anxieties.
So one of the things I've noticed is over the past few years, and particularly with younger people, the discussion around therapy has become less stigmatized. So there are therapists in schools, people are being referred to therapy more, and people are less, people are less fearful of entering the therapeutic space. So as I mentioned, Brent is a very diverse community, and obviously it's predominantly BAME. And I wondered how this discussion around therapy and therapeutic practice, particularly at this time, is being, you know, what's the response by the BAME community to entering the therapeutic space?
Oh, that's quite a deep question. But in terms of the young people, I would say that in my experience, we don't really call it therapy. It's you're coming to kind of talk about how you're feeling. We don't say, you know, oh, this is therapy. This is a space for you. And I don't know. In my experience, I've seen some young people find it hard to say, oh, I'm in therapy or I'm doing counselling, but it's, oh, I'm coming to talk about how I'm feeling. A lot of like young people I've seen, they'll say, you know, if their phone goes off in the session, they'll be like, I'm in a meeting, I'm with my teacher, or, you know, somebody else. So there's still a little bit of, I don't think stigma, but there's still a bit of uncertainty about, oh my gosh, this is therapy, can I name it? But in terms of accessing it, I found that there's high levels of engagement with young people. They're engaging a lot more, they're seeking, and there's a lot more self-referrals I've seen coming through. So, you know, the branches of getting to us is usually through your GP or through self-referral. And I've noticed that a lot of young people have been self-referring themselves.
So, and I guess speaking, you know, from a generational perspective, there is a generation of, particularly from the kind of African and Caribbean community that aren't really up for the disclosure thing. So
yeah, we don't chat our business.
Yeah, it's just not part of the deal. So, so have you noticed that people are less fearful, less reluctant to speak to things that are impacting them and their families, just because this idea of our mortality is being brought very much into our daily lives in a very unique way that we haven't experienced as a collective before? So even from people who are over the age of 18, who are parents, who are even grandparents, are you noticing that we are more inclined to talk our business. We are more inclined to begin to have discussions around what's just happened and how it's affecting us.
Yes, most definitely. I would say that because this is a situation, COVID has affected everyone, regardless of your race, your colour, how much money you have, we all have that in common. So what's been happening is I've noticed that people have felt more kind of comfortable to speak about it because they realise that their therapist is also experiencing the same global situation. So there's a feeling of we're in it together. It's not just you're talking about your business. It's okay, you're feeling uncertain because of what's happening in the world. So I think there's definitely been a change there.
Speaking of global situations, the coronavirus kind of coincided with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in the UK in terms of protests. And there was a kind of palpable sense that whether it's because we were all on lockdown, that people were very keen to express their anger and their frustration at a situation which, while it happened thousands of miles away, resonated very deeply with communities over here. Has that been something that people are bringing into the space along with this anxiety around remaining safe and healthy from a kind of physical point of view? Are things beginning to overlap in that regard? Most definitely, because the kind of BLM movement, George Floyd, again, that just highlighted another situation where people like us feel unsafe. COVID, again, we don't feel safe. There's a threat to life, there's a threat to mortality. So I think that kind of coupled with the COVID situation, I think it inflamed what was going on because, unfortunately, police brutality, injustice, it happens so often and we've seen so many cases of it. But the fact that we are now at home, not being able to go out because of the threat of the virus, it's just put it on another level. So I think it's a twofold situation that's kind of created more anxiety and given people an outlet to express how they're feeling. But unfortunately, there's anger and injustice, which I think mirrors not feeling safe. Thank you. And I guess part of that safety, particularly in the therapeutic setting, is feeling that your therapist gets it.
Yeah.
So again, from a kind of cultural perspective, you're a young black female therapist. Would it be fair to say you have an understanding of the Brent area? Is that right? Do you know Brent?
Most definitely. I have roots in Brent also, and I think that helps. And I've also seen when I've met some clients, some have actually said, "Oh my God, you're black," or you can kind of just see on their face, they're like, "Oh my gosh, it's somebody, from an ethnic minority who may get it." Because I think there's something about coming from immigrant communities that we kind of have a bit of an understanding.
So how difficult is it then, given your understanding, your intimate knowledge of the experiences of young people and older people living in Brent who experience injustice all the time, and bring that into the therapeutic space with a very justifiable point of view, which is, this is happening, it's unfair, I'm not feeling it, it's making me feel a particular way. How do you begin to unpick that, because what the person is saying to you is actually true?
Yeah, and that was something I found quite hard, like during COVID and during the BLM, that they were both full of uncertainties and injustice and being unsafe. So with me, I just place emphasis on being a container for that person, having that space where they can feel safe to say it, and they're not going to have somebody say to them, "Well, this is just life," or "It's happening to everyone," or "Just get over it," or "Just get it." You can sit as an individual with me and tell me how you're feeling, and I will see you and I will hear you, because I think that's one of the important things that came out definitely over these few months, was the power of being seen and the value of life.
What do you mean by that, the power of being seen?
being seen as a black person, being seen as a person of colour, being heard, having your voice heard. You know, these marches, everything that's happening, that's all a display of we're standing up, we need to be seen, we're relevant, we're important, we need to be heard.
And we're visible in a way that counters the narrative, because quite often we're visible within the frame of someone's stereotypical view.
Exactly.
Or their stigma or whatever it is. There's a sense that actually we're not framed in a way that accentuates those things that are beautiful and positive about us as a community. Exactly. Okay. So coming back a bit more to your work, and I think you mentioned earlier on that you don't call it therapy, which is interesting because I get a sense that the way you work is very relational.
Most definitely.
And so you try and create a space within the therapeutic setting where people feel comfortable. How do you do that, particularly with someone who's young, and from Brent, from perhaps the Somali community or the African community? How do you kind of create a sense, because you're young yourself, but there is still an intergenerational gap? How do you create that space?
Ooh, I think my age helps. I think having that understanding helps. And in terms of creating the space, I guess I kind of normalize it. I normalize that it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to kind of look like us and not have to be strong all the time. You can talk about how you're feeling, and it's absolutely safe to do so. I also make sure that I talk about confidentiality and explain the actual procedure of therapy, like what they can expect in terms of a kind of structural level, what they can expect from me. And I also gauge their expectations. So what is it they want from me? What is it that they are expecting from the situation? Let's talk about your anxieties. Let's talk about what you don't know. And we try and fill in those gaps together. So I make sure I do that. I make sure I'm consistent, the same space, the same time, keeping it regular, letting them know that I'm here. If you don't turn up for the session, I will be calling you. Then I will be sending you a letter. I will be making sure that you know that I am here. And if it feels unsafe, it's absolutely okay to feel unsafe. But whilst I work relationally, I have to acknowledge that I'm building a relationship with these people also, with these young people. And young people can see through if you're not genuine or...
Are they surprised when you say something that makes them realise that you actually know where they're coming from?
Yeah, they know that I'm from ends.
Okay, all right. And do they kind of give you a bit of a look? It's like, how do you know that?
How do you know that?
Yeah.
I've had that a couple of times, that, oh my gosh, you said something that, our therapist's supposed to say that. Yes, they are. So whilst I maintain a professional boundary, I'm also very real. And I think that helps me.
So one of the things that I'll be exploring in these podcasts and in other spaces through various platforms that YBF is supporting me with is this idea of trust. And so that's essential to the therapeutic relationship. And I imagine that in various scenarios, trust has been broken. So whether that's in the family, whether that's in the educational setting, but even when we look at how the world is being governed, there is a sense of mistrust. In terms of your work, which is perhaps trying to not necessarily repair what is broken, but to certainly invite people to regain that sense of trust, how difficult is that? Has COVID-19 made this idea of creating a trusting space in the therapy room?
It has had its challenges because, obviously I do work for an institution, and that's the thing. In institution, there's authority figures. And again, if we look at history in terms of having trust in certain authority figures and having trust broken, it's not always been the best. So for me, I acknowledge that. I think the key thing for me in how I work is I acknowledge that there has been difficulties in trust, and that there may be difficulties in our relationship in terms of them trusting me, but that's okay. And we'll work through that. We may not get there within the 6 sessions of IAPT, but we can make a start.
In terms of issues that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, I think we've mentioned isolation and anxiety. But could you say a little bit more about anxiety and bereavement and how this virus has accentuated this sense of our mortality?
I think most definitely there's been so much kind of in the media that's been, I don't want to say scaremongering, but not always helpful. So people are taking that in and they're kind of thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to die? Am I going to be okay? And things like anxiety have just kind of grown because you now have to remember your mask when you go out. You now have to remember your hand gel. You now have to remember if you sit on the bus, is it okay? Is there 2 meters? There's so much that you have to kind of remember before you leave your house. So that's an added level of anxiety that wasn't there before. So I would say that's been the key thing in terms of how can we avoid death, because if we go outside and we don't have our mask and we don't have our gel, are we going to contract it? Are we going to get sick? Are we going to die? So it's quite a lot to kind of have in your mind as a young person, as an older person. It's across the board.
And I guess picking up on that, there is something equal opportunities about coronavirus. It's affecting generations. Within one family, there'll be a number of different generations that will be impacted, and so you'll have someone who's towards the end of their life, but also someone who's very, very young. And I guess that's part of the knock-on challenge, if you like, because you now have people who aren't able to communicate across generations, but going through their own individual challenges.
Yeah.
So do you realize, or do you notice that when somebody comes in, while they are speaking very much about what they're going through, are you aware that actually something is being played out across the whole family?
Most definitely. There's definitely some kind of intergenerational things happening there. And sometimes people come to therapy and they don't realize that they're kind of harboring a lot of stuff that's happened within their family, even generations before them. So sometimes I've brought that into the room and kind of worked with that in terms of who they are now, who they are supposed to be, and who they were according to their families.
So one of the elephants in the room, if you like, as a parent, has been technology. Mm-hmm. So, there was this kind of common theme a few years ago that the internet had become a parent in the room. So, there was another voice that we were having to acknowledge as having an impact on our young people. And so I imagine that has impacted the therapeutic space as well. Pre-lockdown, pre-coronavirus, we were all certainly working with children and young people, we were all being fairly cautious and being fairly protective about children using technology. But obviously because of lockdown, we were then reliant upon it. So how has technology affected the way that you work and the way that you engage with clients?
I'd say it's had a really positive effect, because at the start of the pandemic, I was very skeptical about online therapy because of some of the stuff that I kind of missed, the nonverbal cues, the actual presence of being in the room. But I've actually been able to do really well in terms of reaching people online, and some of the clients that I have actually said that they prefer that they don't have to travel, they can be in the comfort of their room, and it's kind of benefiting them. But also you have the people who it doesn't benefit them, because if they're coming out of their house for a therapeutic space, or their house or their home is a place that is triggering, how helpful is it to have a therapeutic session in there, and how can you facilitate that safely sometimes? And there's also people, unfortunately, who are in situations of things like DV, or if you're sharing, your house sharing, because that was one of the big things in COVID that I've seen, that there were people that I was seeing face to face who are now flatmates with like maybe up to 6 people. Where do you get the privacy to be comfortable to kind of share how you're feeling? So again, I think it's been both a blessing and a curse, dependent on the person. And I haven't seen a difference in the age in terms of the online kind of therapy.
Martina, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks again for your time, but also thanks for the work that you do in Brent to support young people and families.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to know more about mental health services available in Brent, please visit youngbrentfoundation.org. Join us again for the next episode. Until then, thank you for listening.